like to present to you Stephen Yates. He's a safety consultant and the founder and president of Optimum Safety Management. He has a mechanical engineering background with vast experience in both manufacturing operations and construction technology. He's recognized for the development and implementation of effective safety management systems with many local, regional, and national firms. He's also an authorized OSHA outreach trainer. So Steve, I'll hand it over to you now. Thanks again for being here.
Great, thanks Monique. Really appreciate the introduction there and the opportunity to present on behalf of MSCI here and Optimum Safety Management. So I'm going to welcome all of the attendees today. We are going to take a look today at OSHA's Lockout Tagout standard. And what we're doing is we're going to cover some of the frequent citations of the standard by OSHA. We're going to begin by looking at the scope, application, and purpose of the standard. And then we're going to walk through 6 different areas of the standard that show up frequently in citations. One being the energy control program, second, the lockout devices, then we'll move on to energy control procedures, protective materials and hardware, periodic inspections, and then we'll close out with training and communication. What I do want to do is to have everybody note that this webinar is not intended to be an exhaustive review of the entire Lockout Tagout standard. This is a very significant portion of OSHA's legislation. It's a very large standard. There have been many questions asked about this standard to OSHA and letters of interpretation that have been written. For those who are unfamiliar with that process, once a standard is promulgated, it generates questions from the public, and as those questions are sent into OSHA, OSHA will respond in a formal way in what's called a letter of interpretation. So they issue an interpretation of the standard based on the question that was asked, and they will respond in writing. Those letters are all published up on OSHA's website. As you would take a look on OSHA.gov at the standards and regulations, and you would look at the lockout standard, you will find sections, the headings are hyperlinks. And as you click on those hyperlinks, you'll find these letters of interpretation. It's really good because a lot of those questions are ones that you might be asking today even before we get started, or as we complete the webinar today, you might have other questions. Some of those will be answered through OSHA's website, and we'll be able to provide those letters for you. But in addition, the thing to be careful of or to know about is that those letters of interpretation also become part of the law. So as those are published, you are then held to those interpretations. So it's good to know as you work through the standard what letters of interpretations are out there that affect you. But again, this standard is very detailed and has a lot of complexities. It's also applied differently in every workplace. Every workplace takes on its own nuances of how this is applied. So we do want to have you ensure that you're diligent in applying these principles to your specific situation and your specific operating plant environment. So that being said, we're going to just take a step back for a minute, and I'd like to talk about OSHA's reporting requirements. Some of you may know that effective January 1, 2015, OSHA issued a new rule related to reporting events, mandatory reporting events that you have to pick up a phone and actually call and notify the agency about. One of those that they changed was that you are now required to report not only 3 or more employees being hospitalized, but any employee who's hospitalized. So it used to be 3 or more, now it's any one that's hospitalized or given a bed in the hospital, admitted into the hospital. They're also requiring now, in addition to that and fatal injuries, that you report any amputation or loss of an eye. So this is quite a change for OSHA and their reporting requirements. And they're requiring that anytime an employee has any sort of amputation, even the loss of a fingertip that doesn't take bone, that is reported to OSHA if the doctor's diagnosis is an amputation. So we want to be aware of that because we need to comply with that. And that's not only for your full-time workers, but also for any temporary agency workers that you supervise within your workplace. The other thing that I want to make sure you understand is that anytime that you report that to OSHA, it can trigger an inspection. So what we're watching is that during follow-up inspections for amputation, OSHA will come by, they will take a look at the incident scene, whatever the issue is that caused the injury. We'll also then begin to ask questions around lockout tagout if the event that caused the amputation relates to a piece of equipment that should have been locked or tagged. So we want to make sure we're aware of that, because that now exposes you to more risk of OSHA scrutiny, where you may have not been inspected by OSHA ever or not in many years. One small amputation, even like I say, just the tip of a finger, can cause an OSHA inspection. And I'm not trying to minimize that amputation. I'm just saying that even in a small incident like that, we can end up with an inspection. So the step back takes us back to October of last year, where we did the MSCI webinar on the top 10 most frequently cited OSHA standards. Those of you that were on that webinar will recall that the control of hazardous energy, or lockout tagout, was the #2 most frequently cited in service centers and the #1 most frequently cited in the mill environment. So this is high on OSHA's list. It's a hot topic for them. And when they come out, what we're finding is that they're not just citing the basics, they're actually starting to really get very detailed and in-depth into this standard. It appears that the more safety savvy the employers become, the more OSHA is taking them to task on the finer details of the program. So we really want to focus today on the sections of the standard that OSHA is citing frequently, things like developed procedures, the program document itself, periodic inspections of those procedures and the people performing the procedures, general training, have you performed the training itself, and then specific enforcement of the procedures. Is there disciplinary action? Is there retraining, and so on? So that's where we're headed today and the reasons why. Here's another reason why, just to keep in mind. Along with OSHA increasing the reporting requirement, they also, as part of a bipartisan budget bill that was passed last year, they tucked in an increase in fines and penalties into that bill. OSHA had not increased their penalties since October of 1990. So we've had a $7,000 maximum for a long time. What this bill just did was it tied the OSHA fines and penalties to the Consumer Price Index. And it's allowing OSHA to do a one-time adjustment for the CPI from the period from 1990 through October of 2015. Now, those new penalties will go into effect August 1st, and experts across a number of industries are agreeing that they're likely to climb close to a 78% jump in those penalties. That's a fairly substantial increase, taking what we know today as a maximum for a serious citation from $7,000 up to about $12,700. Larger repeats then for repeats or larger penalties for repeats or willfuls will top $120,000 per offense, currently $70,000. And then these will continue to adjust every year according to the cost of living adjustment. So it's a never-ending increase for OSHA. They'll be able to just continue to chase these rates up. So again, we want you to be aware of that. This is all increased pressure on employers, and it's something to take note of and be aware of. Now, as we dive into today's topic, we're going to begin talking about the scope, application, and purpose of 29 CFR 1910.147, the lockout tagout standard, or control of hazardous energy. So the standard covers the servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment. What that means is that anytime an employee has to service or maintain a piece of equipment and remove a guard to grease it, adjust it, change something, replace parts, etc., OSHA is concerned to make sure that that equipment is put into a zero energy state, and in particular in the area that could affect the employee, to make sure that they're safe as they remove those guards and perform that servicing or maintenance activity. This section of the standard, however, when we look at the application, does not cover normal production operations. And we want to make sure that we understand that, a lot of our clients will ask us, well, what do we do when we have to change a tool or make an adjustment in a die on the fly, and we need the machine operational in order to be able to do that? So we need to understand that if the servicing or maintenance operation that takes place during normal production operations doesn't meet these next two requirements, then it would be covered by the standard. Otherwise, you're not subject to lockout tagout. So if an employee is required to remove or bypass that guard or safety device in order to make the adjustment, and they have to place their hand or any part of their body into the machine where any work is being done, then this operation would be covered under the lockout tagout standard, and lockout tagout would apply. However, there's an exception, and that exception is for minor tool changes and adjustments. So if those minor tool changes and adjustments are routine, they're repetitive, or integral to the use of the equipment, as long as you can provide alternate measures that provide the same effective protection as a lockout tagout program while that adjustment is being performed, then you are exempt from the lockout tagout standard for that particular operation. I can tell you that the OSHA inspectors are very tight on this. They want to make sure that the employee is protected at all times, especially with a hazardous or dangerous point of operation. So you want to make sure that you're providing an alternate measure that provides a similar level of protection. If you can't prove that, and the employee is opening a door or a guard and reaching into the machine, you will end up with a citation from OSHA. Now, the standard also does not apply to work on cord and plug equipment. So much like the grinder that we're showing here in the photo, as you would change the tool bit on this grinder, you can unplug the grinder from the wall. That renders the grinder inoperable. And as long as that plug is under the exclusive control of the person servicing the tool, they have control of the plug in front of them, it's right there, there's no need to do anything like lockout tagout on this. This would apply to smaller tools in a workplace that are cord and plug, equipment that you can unplug like a welder. If you unplug it from the wall and you can maintain control over that plug, there's not an issue, okay? But we want to make sure we understand it's cord and plug, that it needs to be under the exclusive control of the user. Where this falls apart is if you have something like a miter box saw that is mounted on a bench in one area, and then the plug passes around the corner or through a wall to be plugged in, you need to be able to unplug it and bring the cord back to the saw and put it under exclusive control of the operator. If you can't do that, you end up needing a plug bucket or some of the other tools that we're going to see on one of the later slides, and I'll point that out to you in the event that they can't keep that plug under their exclusive control. The section of the standard, as we see here in this section, is expressly, the purpose is expressly to prevent injury to employees. So OSHA is aware that when you have equipment that can cause shearing or punching, cutting operations to heavy steel sections, that equipment can also cause a lot of damage to a human body. They're very concerned to make sure that they prevent those injuries, and that's the purpose of the lockout standard. Now, that should line up with our safety culture within an operating facility, and for many of you it does. If it doesn't, it needs to become lined up, and it's great that you're here on the webinar today and that you can learn more about that and begin to employ these principles in your workplace. So this is the purpose of the OSHA standard that we're looking at. At this point, I want to begin walking through the 6 different sections of the standard that are frequently cited. The first one we're going to take a look at is the Energy Control Program, actually the program document. So OSHA standards state that the employer shall, that means we don't have an option, we must, it's the law, so we shall establish a program consisting of 3 different elements: energy control procedures, employee training, and periodic inspections. The program document that we're talking about today dictates how those things are going to be done at your workplace. And we're going to talk specifically about some of the measures for each of those 3 items, as they are very frequently cited by OSHA. But specifically when we're talking about an energy control program, we're talking about what you see on the screen here, where we have a lockout tagout program. This will have things like a purpose statement, roles and responsibilities, definitions, steps to lockout. What are the 6 steps we're going to take to de-energize a piece of equipment? What are the steps we're going to take to re-energize it? How are we going to train our employees? How are we going to handle retraining and disciplinary action? So many of the things that we're going to talk about today would get called out within your written program document. This document should provide a framework for your operation to take the OSHA standards and adopt them into your workplace. So it's never enough just to print the OSHA standard and put that into a book and call that your program. The program has to show how you're going to comply with that standard. And in some cases, we'll talk about today with best practice, to actually go above and beyond. So just keep in mind that your program answers this question: how will my organization implement this program? That's really the question it should answer. Moving on from the energy control program, we're going to move into lockout devices. And what we're talking about here is the actual equipment that's mounted to the wall in your facilities or mounted to your equipment that will allow you to de-energize, lock, and control that hazardous energy. So oftentimes we think about energy in terms of electrical energy. It's the one that's most prevalent and frequently recognizable by most folks. So when we think about energy isolating devices, we think about things like electrical disconnect switches, fuse disconnect switches, circuit breakers. Those are all energy isolating devices that relate to electrical energy. You can also have valves on pneumatic lines or hydraulic lines, things like that you can use then to turn and isolate the electrical or chemical or pneumatic or hydraulic energy that's coming through that pipe. So what OSHA is telling us here is that if the energy isolating device is not capable of being locked out, which means you can't actually put a lock on it, you can turn the valve, but the valve doesn't have a way of being locked, then you must utilize or shall utilize a tagout system. Tagout systems are literally just the tag. They're not the lock. They're not secure. And if you're the one with your fingers in that machine, I think you want a little bit more than a tag that's going to protect your fingers. So we don't recommend using only tagout. We want to try and get to the point where we can actually use lockout on all of our devices. Now, the second paragraph here states that if an energy isolating device is capable of being locked out, then the employer shall utilize lockout, unless you can demonstrate the tagout is equally effective. I would say that you would be hard-pressed and challenged to prove that. So typically, default to lockout if at all possible. And then OSHA also tells us here that after January 2nd of 1990, whenever there's been any sort of retrofit to a piece of equipment, either replacement, major repair, renovation, or modification, you must upgrade the electrical equipment that's connecting that device, or I keep defaulting to electrical, but not only the electrical, but pneumatic or any other valves, you must upgrade those to devices that can accept a lockout. So if you're in an operating plant that has equipment that looks like the vintage one on the right-hand side here, and that's quite old. I haven't seen one in a plant like that in a long time. But if you have equipment like that, you can see that you're not able to place a lock through a hole there when that handle is in the off position. You're going to need to replace that device at the point where you're upgrading your equipment. Most of you are working in facilities that have equipment that looks like the ones on the left. The square D device might look a little bit different depending on the style of enclosure and the rating and the location, if you're in wet location, etc. But what these devices now have in common is there's a hole in the handle and a hole in that brass-colored clip, the bronze-colored clip there. And as you would pull the handle down into the off position, you can then place a lock with a tag on it through that hole, lock the lock, and then render that disconnect inoperable so that the energy cannot be restored. So this is what OSHA is talking about when it talks about lockout tagout devices in 147C2. All right, moving on, we're going to talk now about energy control procedures. Now there's a lot to be said here, and we're going to try and do the best we can to cover this and hopefully answer many of the questions you might have. OSHA tells us under this section of the standard that procedures shall be, again, not optional, shall be developed, documented, and utilized for the control of potentially hazardous energy. So anytime that you have an employee that has to remove guards or service a piece of equipment, they need to have a procedure that dictates how they do that. Where are the energy sources? What are the energy sources? How do I disconnect them? How do I lock them out? How do I verify that they are no longer operable? I need to have all of those procedures documented like you see here for every piece of equipment with one exception, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But you can see here in the diagram that we're showing a mixing device. That device has multiple water valves, electrical energy sources, hydraulic, pneumatic. It's got many different energy sources that are here. And what we're showing is where those energy sources are located, what order they're to be disconnected in, and then each of your employees that would walk over to work on that equipment would know how to operate the electrical and other energy source disconnects to render that machine totally inoperable and at a zero energy state. So hopefully that's all making sense. Let's move on to an exception to this. A lot of people ask us, well, does that mean that I have to write a procedure for every single piece of equipment in my facility? And the answer is no. We already know that we don't need to write a procedure for anything that's cord and plug controlled. As long as it's a single energy source, you can pull the plug, keep it under your control, and that machine is inoperable. You can test the button to make sure it doesn't work, and then at that point you can change the blade or the unit or whatever. Here is a second exception for you. I like to call this simple equipment. The employer need not document the required procedure for a particular machine or equipment when all of the following elements exist. Now this is going to go on for 3 slides. There's 8 different items that we need to check off of a list to make sure that you're not, that you don't have, and that you make sure that you can check off. And once you can check it off, you don't need to do a procedure for that piece of equipment. So the first is that the machine or equipment has no potential for stored or residual energy or reaccumulation of stored energy after it's shut down. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about things like capacitors. If you've ever worked on an old air conditioning unit, you know that they have capacitors in that help the motor starter get the compressor moving when you start that air conditioner up. And that capacitor, if you cross both of the terminals on that capacitor, you will get the shock of a lifetime because it stores quite a bit of energy, and it'll release it right into your body across those 2 tips, across the 2 terminals. So if your equipment has capacitors, you would not be able to check off on this. You would have to notify your employees that it has a capacitor. They would have to know how to de-energize it. So that's a potential for stored or residual energy. Same with a punch press that might have a flywheel. If that flywheel is rotating, that has residual energy that is stored in that flywheel, and until that flywheel stops, they have the opportunity to hit the foot pedal and actuate that press. Now, this is on old style presses. So a piece of equipment like that could not be locked out under this exception using no procedure. You'd have to have a procedure. So the second checkoff is that the machinery equipment has a single energy source that can be readily identified and isolated. So if your equipment is something like an arc welder, these typically are mounted on the floor in a facility. They have a piece of liquid-tight conduit that comes out of them up into a disconnect. That disconnect is right behind the welder. The welder might have an identifier on it that says W1. The disconnect says W1. It's readily apparent that that's the only energy source, and it's right there. I can turn that disconnect down, pull the switch down or the lever down, and throw one lock and tag through it and lock it. I've now rendered that machine inoperable. I can check off that, yes, I only have one energy source. It's readily identified, and I can isolate it. Okay, moving on to item 3. So if we can check off that the isolation and locking out of that energy source will completely de-energize and deactivate the machine or equipment, will it? Only you or your maintenance department would be able to answer that question. If it's a single energy source, shutting it off, everything is de-energized, then you can check off item 3. Item 4, the machine or equipment is isolated from that energy source and locked out during servicing or maintenance. So in my example, I talked about pulling the disconnect switch down, putting in a lock and tag, and locking it to isolate it. That means I can check off item 4, that I can actually isolate it and stop it from being turned on because I've locked it out. Item 5, a single lockout device will achieve a locked out condition. So fairly straightforward. One energy source, one lockout device, and I'm one and done kind of a situation. Then I can go ahead and check off item 5. Item 6, the lockout device is under the exclusive control of the authorized employee performing the servicing or maintenance. So what this means is when I affix my lock and tag to that disconnect, what do I do with the key? Do I take the key and I put that into my pocket so I've now got exclusive control of the key? Are there spare keys for that lock? If that's the case, the employee does not have exclusive control. So some of you may have spare keys for locks within your facility, and those need to be kept under a supervisor's tight control. If those keys are allowed to be accessed by anyone else, you blow the exclusive control, and at that point you've got a problem with your lockout program. So make sure that it's one lock per key or one lock for each employee, and maybe they have 6 or 8 locks for themselves. They're all keyed alike. They only use their own locks. So now they have exclusive control of each of those locks. So we have to make sure that that's the case. The servicing or maintenance under item 7 here cannot create a hazard for other employees. So some of your devices that you're going to lock out are in line, in a production line, with other employees, with other equipment. And if I lock out a particular module of the machine, I might affect other employees. If that's the case, that doesn't meet this exception under what I'm calling simple equipment, and you can't use this exception. You must have a procedure then. Item 8, the employer, in utilizing this exception, has had no accidents, I'll say injuries, right? No such thing as an accident, but no injuries involving the unexpected activation or re-energization of the machine or equipment during service or maintenance. Do you have a track record of incidents occurring where people have been injured with this piece of equipment in a lockout context? And if that's the case, you must have a procedure. So, meeting all 8 of those exception requirements, if you do, you can then provide lockouts for simple equipment without a procedure. So you can avoid having to write procedures for every piece of equipment. So what I've screened up here is a pretty ugly photo of a metal chop saw. And as you look at this photo, those of you that are seasoned safety professionals are seeing some other violations. You might see things like the electrical disconnect is blocked. It's in a poor location. There's housekeeping issues, a lot of grease and material around, etc. There's a lot of things wrong in this photo. But what it does is it illustrates a simple disconnect with a simple piece of equipment, one energy source. So at the point where you would have something like this, you would be able to use a single source lockout with no procedure. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions on that, we really do want to hear from you. So feel free to submit your questions to Monique through the question area, and we will get back to you on those questions in a formal response. So moving back into the energy control procedures, OSHA also tells us that when we do have to provide a procedure, that procedure needs to clearly and specifically outline the scope, the purpose, the authorization, the rules, and techniques to be used for controlling energy. They go on to tell us many things about that, and they're very specific. But we want to make sure that we understand that the scope is defined. So like in the case of some examples I'm going to pull up here, these are example lockout tagout procedures or energy control procedures. The one is for a food processing piece of equipment, the other is for a mixer. And you will find that if you have equipment that has many energy sources, you will sometimes have you will always have a procedure for how to de-energize everything, to take it into a complete zero energy state for maintenance to come in and overhaul the equipment. But you also may have other servicing operations, maybe a lubrication operation where you don't need to shut down your hydraulics. You're just opening a cover and you want to shut down all of the electromechanical components so that you can get in and grease something. So you might have a greasing procedure or some other procedure that would be for a specific operation, and that's okay to do, but it needs to be defined and the purpose needs to be stated, and then you would not have all of the different energy sources noted. You would only have the ones that are required for that particular portion of the procedure. And again, hopefully that makes sense. Let us know if not, and we can further identify that and try and help you out with it. You're also free at any time to call the safety helpline here at Optimum through MSCI's number on the website. You'll have it here in the handouts at the end of the presentation also. Moving on to our next section is protected materials and hardware. So now we've written a program, we've written procedures, and now we want to allow the people that are going to actually do the work in the equipment to have some equipment to lock out and tag out that equipment. So OSHA tells us here in C5 that we need to provide, the employer shall provide all of the locks and tags and fasteners and hasps and so on that the employee needs, the authorized employee needs in order to perform the lock and tag operations. So you'll see here in this kit, this is a common recommendation for us, is that you would provide a kit like this for each of your authorized employees. It has several locks that are keyed alike, has several tags, some hasps if they're doing group lockout. It has breaker clips. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see the yellow device that's hanging or standing up. That's a cord and plug bucket. So if you have a device where you need to change a tool or lock it out and you cannot retain control of the plug because it's in another room or it's just out of your reach or you want to make sure it's secure, you can open that up. The top cover expands and opens. You can drop the plug right into there and then close it again. The opening will clamp around the cord, and then you can put your lock through one of those three holes on the side, and you effectively lock the plug end into a plug bucket. At that point, you can be reasonably assured that nobody's going to cut that off and plug your tool in while you're servicing it. Over on the far left, round red, looks like a bagel that's open. That device is a valve cover, and that's designed for use around a round-handled valve, like you might have seen on the front of your house for your water spigot. If that doesn't have a lock hole in it where you can lock it, you would take this device, you would open it up, place it around that valve handle after you've isolated the energy and turned the valve off. As you close it, the holes will line up. You'll be able to put a lock through the hole with a tag, and now you've effectively locked out that valve. So these are just some different devices that we find employers giving to their employees to provide a method for the lock and tag process. OSHA goes on to tell us that these devices will only be used for controlling energy and shall not be used for other purposes. So we don't want to use a lockout lock to lock up a tool locker or our toolbox or some other device, an electrical cabinet, etc. We want to use it only for lockout tagout because we want people to understand when they see that lock that a piece of equipment is being serviced, and don't mess with that lock, don't cut it off, don't try and start the equipment, etc. OSHA also tells us that these devices need to be durable, so capable of withstanding the environment, constructed so they'll withstand the weather conditions in either wet or damp locations. Some of you might be using them in rooms where you're painting or blasting. And then make sure that they won't deteriorate in corrosive environments where there's acid or alkali chemicals stored or handled. Furthermore, OSHA tells us that the devices need to be standardized. So we talked a little bit about this already, but here's just an illustration. Standardized within the facility. So you see that the lock on the left might have been something we used in high school to lock out our locker or to lock our locker in gym class. You look over at the right, and these are very different. And that's exactly what you want it to be. You want them to stand out and be separate. These are actually a great lock. They're a plastic body lock with a steel hasp, and they're corrosion resistant in many environments. A lot of people choose to use a lock like this because they're lighter weight and they're a little bit cheaper, easier to replace, that kind of thing. They can be very effective for lockout tagout. Okay? OSHA also requires that the locks are substantial. So substantial enough to prevent removal without a tool. We don't want to have something that's locking out that you can walk up to and twist and break off and then throw the disconnect back on. So OSHA even goes as far as to say, such as with the use of bolt cutters or other metal cutting tools like a grinder, right? If a lock is on a piece of equipment and that employee is missing, we can't find them, we don't want to just walk over and cut the lock off and re-energize it. OSHA has a whole procedure that should be called out in your program for how you would do that type of thing if it's missing. I know it sounds crazy, but people have been found to climb into a cabinet on a large piece of equipment while it's under a servicing operation, and they might actually fall asleep in it or take a nap in it and that kind of thing. I know it sounds kind of crazy, but it does happen. If you came along, you couldn't find Ralph, and you didn't know what he was doing that equipment, and you cut Ralph's lock off and you re-energize the equipment, Ralph could end up in a bad spot. So we want to make sure that we have a procedure. We exhaust every effort to find him. Supervisors are involved. We literally call his home, that type of thing. But we want to make it so the lock is substantial enough that you have to actually cut it off. And then there's a whole process of documenting that as well that OSHA requires. So tagout devices. When we use a tag, which we should always do, and I'll show you in the next photo why, but we should always use a tag. When we attach that, it should either be a heavy tag that has a grommet that will fit through the lock, or have a heavy wire tie, something like a large, thick nylon cable tie that won't corrode in the environment. And that would be sufficient then to make it substantial enough that the tag is not going to wither, fall off, become illegible, that type of thing. OSHA also requires that our tags are identifiable. This is extremely critical. You'll see here in this photo, this would be a violation of the lockout standard because it does not have the identity of the employee that affixed this lock to the equipment. We want to make sure that the employee is identified so that we know who put this on, and we know that it's Ralph, and we're going to go talk to Ralph to make sure we understand what he's doing with the equipment or why it's still under lockout. If we don't have that information there, we don't know who's locked, we don't know what's going on with the equipment and so on, we might just end up cutting it off and returning the equipment to use and find out that there's loose bolts or parts missing in the machine. So very important that we make sure that people identify themselves. And then those tags need to be consistent. They need to warn against the hazardous conditions. You would have seen in the last photo it said danger, do not operate. So it's a danger hazard. It tells us it's a pretty serious thing. Don't operate this equipment. And that legend needs to be standardized and visible on all of the tags, pardon me. Next section we're going to move into is periodic inspection. This is probably one of the more complex sections of this standard. So no doubt we'll have some questions. Again, we're looking forward to fielding those for you. Please make sure you're submitting those as we go through the webinar. This section of the standard states that the employer shall conduct a periodic inspection of the procedure, each procedure, at least annually. So they tell us periodic, which means every so often, but then they also go on to say don't let it be more than a year. So you can do it more frequently, but don't go beyond a year. And the reason that we're going to do this inspection is to ensure that the procedure and all of the requirements of the standard are being followed. So that tells us we're not just going to review or inspect the procedure, we're actually going to review or inspect the people that are doing it. So when we do that, that periodic inspection is going to be performed by an authorized person. Now, an authorized person is someone who's been through the training for Lockout Tagout. They can recognize the hazards. They understand how to de-energize and energize or restore equipment. And they understand why they're doing it and what the different energy sources might be, so they can check the procedure and the process while they watch it. So we're going to want to make sure that it's an authorized person, and it has to be one other than one that uses that procedure. So oftentimes it'll be your safety professional on staff who will do this. There'll be an authorized person, and they won't be necessarily using the procedure. They'll be able to stand back and watch it and make sure it's all working right. Or it could be a peer, maybe a machine operator on a different type of machine, or a mechanic who works in a different area of the plant. But it should be somebody different than one that's familiar with that procedure and would just kind of run through it and check off that everything's good. Moving into the next section here, the periodic inspection shall be conducted to correct any deviations or inadequacies identified. So there's a purpose behind our inspection. We want to correct the deviations from the procedure from the people, but also any problems with the procedure. We want to do that so that the procedure is correct and it can be trusted. Where lockout's used, the inspection shall include a review of the individual employee's responsibilities. So we want to make sure that while the employee is being reviewed, that the person inspecting is talking to them about their responsibilities under the standard and under this procedure, making sure they're real clear and that they understand it. And then where tagout is used, and that's where tagout's used alone, so we're not going to cover this, the requirements are much more stringent. We're going to want to make sure that we're using lockout. If you're using tagout only, you've got some additional things you need to do beyond what I'm covering here, and they really need to be taken care of well. And it's a pretty vulnerable program, so be careful with using tagout only. Here, like in some of the other areas of the lockout standard, but very few areas of the entire OSHA standards, OSHA is requiring a certification. So they want you to certify, to document that you've done this and put the person's name down that did it, that you've done this inspection. That certification should identify the machine or equipment, should identify the date of the inspection, the employees that were reviewed, and then the person that was performing the inspection. They should sign off certifying that they did this. We want to make sure these records are valid, they're not falsified, so they hold up in an OSHA inspection. And definitely not something to mess around with. Falsifying records like this can really land people into jail and with heavy penalties personally. So be very careful in that regard. So with the confusion around these periodic inspections, we've got a lot of procedures and a lot of people and so on. How do we do this? We get asked this a lot. So I've come up with a bit of an example here to try and illustrate the point. A pretty common situation is that you might have, let's say, 100 pieces of equipment in your facility that have required procedures to be developed. And you might have 10 authorized employees. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 machine operators and then 6 or 7 mechanics within your facility that are operating the equipment and servicing it. What we recommend is that you group the procedures into like equipment, similar equipment. If you have 10 bandsaws, you can put those all in a group if they have similar lockout, similar energy sources, and so on. You might have several coil processing machines, and each of the stages of those can be put into a similar procedure. And then the idea is that every year, within the year, you need to review every authorized person on each group that they're responsible to lock out. So reviewing every authorized person on every group or style of equipment that they're responsible to lock out every year. It's a big task. So in order to facilitate annual inspections, we recommend a couple of measures be put in place. One of those measures is that you would create a log of your procedures. You'll see here the document in the back. It has the equipment name. and it has the group of the equipment, what the nomenclature is for that group. And then what date was it created, and when was it last revised, and when was its annual inspection done? You would allocate a group number then to each type of equipment and show that on your log. And then we'd recommend that you create a log of authorized persons. We don't have that shown on the screen here, but that's fairly simple. You create a list of all of your authorized personnel, and you might note the equipment groups that they work on. They work on the bandsaws, and they work on the automated milling machines. And different people work on these different equipment. So now you can create a matrix that cross-references the two of these logs. And at that point, you'll be able to inspect all of your authorized people every year on each of the groups of equipment that they operate. And you'll use a form similar to this periodic inspection report that you see here in front of you. And it's a periodic inspection certification, because you're going to certify at the bottom who the inspector was and who the employee was that was certified. Okay, or have them both sign off. Very good. Hopefully that answers a lot of those questions on this topic. And again, feel free to call in on the helpline or ask your questions. We'll try and help. Moving into the last section now, training and communication on the home stretch. OSHA tells us here that the employer shall provide training to ensure, so you've got to be sure of these things when you're done. Number one is that there's an understanding of the purpose and function of the energy control program. So the purpose and function of the program, how is it that it works out in the workplace? You also need to ensure that the employee, the authorized employee, has acquired not only the knowledge, the head knowledge, but also the skills for safe application, usage, and removal of energy controls. So really good here, OSHA in essence has written us 2 learning objectives for our training program. So now we can go at making sure that we're going to do this. So the first one we're going to do by doing some classroom training. We're going to perform classroom training where people understand the energy sources and so on. The second one we're going to do by skills training, actually out on the shop floor, where they get their first periodic inspection, their initial inspection, where you watch them walking through a procedure, making sure that they can perform the operation to a level of skill that you can determine they've acquired the right knowledge and skills to perform the work. All right. Now, who do we need to train? Well, OSHA breaks our training down into 3 groups for us. They tell us first that we need to train authorized employees. So I've already talked about this earlier. The authorized employee is one who's trained, has the understanding of the hazards. They know about the energy sources in your workplace. They know about the magnitude of those. And then they know how you want them, the methods and means to isolate and control that energy source. You're also going to need to train the affected people or the affected employees. This is the people that might work in the area where your maintenance technicians are going to come in and do a maintenance operation. They need to know when you see these locks and tags or see these authorized people working in that area, don't mess with the equipment. It's under lockout tagout. Don't try and start it. Just leave it alone. You can do that training effectively through a new hire orientation. So at the first assignment of the employee in the workplace. Secondly, through an annual toolbox talk. That's a great refresher and a great way to document and make sure you have documentation of your entire workforce. The third type of employee is other employees. So these are people who might work in an area where those procedures are going to be utilized, but it's not readily apparent to them every day right next to where they're working. And you'd want them to know it, so if they're walking through that area, they can be aware of it as well. And OSHA calls those other employees. So the way that we recommend you meet this is that you do an annual authorized employee training. It's not required annual, but it is a best practice. And then an annual toolbox talk for each of the other 2 types of employees. Now, retraining needs to occur at a couple of different events. Number one, whenever there's a change in either the job assignment, the machine, the equipment, the processes, or there's a change in the energy control procedure. So anytime you have an alteration, you've got to retrain the employees that it affects. Also, anytime you're doing either your periodic inspection or you're doing a walk around or you're in the plant and you happen to see somebody doing something that evidences a lack of knowledge or a deficiency, deviation, or inadequacy in their knowledge, you would then need to retrain them. The retraining should reestablish the employee's proficiency. So you don't need to sit them back in the classroom and go through an entire 2-hour training again with them, but you should have a briefing on the job site, out in the plant, walk through it, show them what they did wrong, show them how to do it right, make sure they understand it and can demonstrate it, and have a sign-off sheet that you can certify you retrained them. Those are great records to show OSHA that your program is effective and implemented well. Again, just mentioned it here with the sign-offs. You want to make sure that you're certifying that that employee training has been accomplished. So whether that's initial, whether that's for affected and other or authorized employees, or whether it's retraining, documentation is required. Just remember the saying with OSHA, if it's not documented, it's not considered done. So we want to make sure we document everything that we do and we keep those records. Recommended best practice, I've already mentioned it, annual refresher for each type of employee. People forget these rules. They benefit from refreshers. It's always a good thing to do. So definitely recommend implementing an annual refresher. All right. So we started out at the beginning of our webinar, we talked about the top 10 most frequently cited OSHA standards. And during the webinar, we've covered those. Development of procedures, the program, periodic inspections, general training, and then specific enforcement of procedures. All of this was related to OSHA compliance and making sure that we do the best we can to protect the company and the employees from injury and the company from loss in the event of an OSHA inspection. Even more important than OSHA, and I apologize for the graphic photo, but I think it's necessary that we understand that even more important than OSHA, we need to protect our people. They're absolutely, without a doubt, the most valuable asset you have in your workplace. First time I ever did a trainer program, we were in a classroom and each of us had to student teach a section. One of the guys got up and he was student teaching Lockout, and he was pretty passionate about it. And at the end of the class, he held up his hand and he showed that he was missing 2 fingers on his hand. And he said, you know, I'm the director of operations at my facility. I have ultimate responsibility for safety, and I know all too well what happens when lockout tagout goes wrong. And he told the story as a younger tradesman working on a printing press that somebody had removed a lock and re-energized the machine as he was working in an area right between 2 nip points on a roller, between the ingoing nip point on 2 rollers. And as the roller spun up and energized, it caught his fingertips and began to draw him into the machine. He's a pretty big guy, and he had enough strength literally to rip the tips of his fingers off, to pull his body back and his arm back, because had he not done that, his entire body would have ended up eventually going through that machine. And as he did that, he strained all of the muscles in his shoulders and tore ligaments and so on. But he was there to tell us about it that day. We want to make sure that people don't end up in the situation like you see on the screen or in a situation like this gentleman talked about. So make sure that we're applying proper lockout tagout. Many of you work in workplaces where this is being done already. However, I would challenge you, the more and more workplaces that we look at, especially in this industry, we find deficiencies in lockout tagout programs that are substantial. Use the information today, give us a call with questions, brush up your lockout program, make sure it's effective, and use this information to make sure that you're a better workplace. For those of you that don't have lockout tagout in play, please implement a lockout tagout program. If you need help with that, give us a call. We'll do everything we can to help you. As Monique mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we are going to have some free resources coming out to you. We have webinar slide handouts that will come out. We do have Q&A responses for any questions that have been asked. We'll go ahead and get those responses. Those resources will take a couple of days to get out, so be patient with us on that. We'll want to make sure we have a thorough response to any questions. Feel free to browse our website at OSHASafetymanagement.com. We have blog articles there, You can sign up for a monthly newsletter that we have there as well that includes a lot of free resources on different issues related to OSHA and safety management in general. We'd love to have you participate in those resources. Please be aware also that Optimum has a safety management assessment service we provide. We can actually come into your facility, perform a gap analysis across 30 key performance indicators. This is an excellent way to measure your safety management program today and determine how you're doing and where there's hot spots that you can then work on to be more effective in your safety management. We have a number of MSCI members that have taken advantage of this, and they're speaking volumes towards the value of it. They found it to be a great value for them. So we just offer that to you. Give us a call. We'd love to fill you in more on that. And again, as always, feel free to utilize the safety helpline. Here's the contact information for the helpline. So on behalf of MSCI and Optimum Safety Management, I would just like to thank you today for participating in our webinar. Hopefully it's been of value to you. Continue to check back and watch your email box for the next one coming up next quarter. So thank you again for your participation here today with us, and have a safe day.